am Martin Luther King Jr. by Grace Norwich. Introduction, page 4. Change is hard. Most people don't like any kind of change. So you can imagine how hard it is to change strong beliefs. I'm talking about racism and the idea that some folks are better than others just because of the color of their skin. During my time, many Americans thought this was true. In some towns, black people couldn't stay in hotels or eat in restaurants. They even had separate water fountains for us, as if our dark skin was contagious. It didn't matter how well we did in school, how hard we worked at our jobs, or how devoted we were to our families. We were often thought of as ignorant and even dangerous. Despite their treatment, I always believed I was just as good as anyone else. So I set about changing not only people's hearts and minds, but also the laws of our land. As I put it in my famous I Have a Dream speech, my goal was that people of color, including my own children, could one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It wasn't easy. Like I said, change is hard, even painful. Despite my brains, my supporters, and my skills as a speaker, I was challenged every day. But I never gave up believing and working toward my dream that little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I am Martin Luther King Jr. People you will meet. Martin Luther King Jr., a great student who grew up to become a popular minister and one of the most important leaders of all time for his work to bring equality to all races using the nonviolent approach. Alberta Christine Williams, Martin's mother, a loving and educated woman who attended college, which was unusual in her day. Her father was a minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Martin Luther King Sr., the son of sharecroppers, Martin Sr. worked his way out of poverty, went to college, and became a minister at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Coretta Scott, Martin's wife, a college graduate and the mother of their 4 children, who continued to advocate for civil rights long after her husband's death. Rosa Parks, a black seamstress who refused to follow the rules and moved to the back of the bus, kicking off a massive bus boycott and the modern civil rights movement. John F. Kennedy, the senator whose brother Robert helped get Martin out of jail and who was elected the first Catholic president of the United States, thanks in part to black voters. He was assassinated in 1963. Eugene Bull Connor, Birmingham's public safety commissioner, who threatened anyone who tried to bring white and black people together. George Wallace, the Alabama governor who was so against integration that he broke the law to keep it from happening in his own state. Lyndon B. Johnson, the vice president who became president after John F. Kennedy's assassination and who succeeded in getting the Civil Rights Act passed. Chapter 1, An Early Lesson, page 13. The idea of right and wrong was part of Martin Luther King's life from the moment he was born in Atlanta, Georgia, on January 15th, 1929. That's because Martin's father and grandfather were both church ministers. And not just any ministers. They were both pastors of Ebenezer Baptist Church, which had the most influential African American congregation in Atlanta. Martin Sr. was a very large and strict man. He had high standards and lots of rules, which he expected Martin, his older sister Willie Christine, and his younger brother Alfred Daniel to obey. If that seems harsh, perhaps it's because Martin Sr. came from harsh circumstances. Born into a family of sharecroppers, farmers who worked on other people's land and were paid in just enough crops to survive, he grew up very poor. With his mother's support, he left home to go to Atlanta in search of a better life when he was only 15. Martin Sr. worked extremely hard, earning his high school degree and then attending Morehouse, a prestigious all-black college. Martin's mother, Alberta, was quiet, loving, and very easy to talk to, but she was also smart and accomplished something hardly any women, especially black women, did in those days. She earned a college degree. Alberta's father was a famous pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where her husband also became a minister. No wonder the church was a second home to Martin Jr., who attended Sunday school and sang in the choir. When he wasn't at church or at home, Martin was usually playing on his peaceful, shady block with a little white boy whose father had a store across the street from his house. But when he turned 6, Martin got his first bitter taste of the prejudice he'd spend the rest of his life fighting. The two best friends were sent to different schools. They were segregated, which means they were separated by color. The white boy went to one for white children, while Martin went to one for black children. That wasn't all. The white boy's father told him that he couldn't play with Martin anymore. When Martin heard the news, he cried and cried. He didn't understand why they couldn't be friends. They both still liked to ride their bikes, fly model airplanes, and play ball. He had no clue about racism. Martin's mom and dad had to sit him down to explain a fact that was hard to believe. Many white people didn't like black people because of the color of their skin. He was dumbfounded and angry. How could anyone think like that? His mother and father also explained that as Christians, it was important to forgive and not lash out at anyone, even racist whites who didn't think he was good enough to play with. It was a hard concept to wrap his head around, but one that would become the foundation for his beliefs. Martin's mom added one last idea. Even though they were asking him to forgive white people, he didn't need to believe what they thought about him. No matter what people said, he was just as good as anyone else and could make a difference in this world. Turn back to page 18. Segregation. During Martin's time, Many places in the South enforced segregation with the Jim Crow laws. The laws were named for a white performer who was one of the first to use burnt cork to make his face look black, which was called blackface makeup. In the early 1800s, he made fun of black people by doing a silly song and dance as the character Jim Crow. The act was a big success and took him all over the country and even abroad. The name came to symbolize anything racist, including the laws that separated whites from blacks in schools, restaurants, movie theaters, and hotels. Under these regulations, black people had to ride in the back of the bus. And if they didn't, they could be thrown in jail. In high school, Martin was returning home from a speech contest he'd won in a nearby town when the bus driver told him and his teacher they had to get up and give their seats to white people. Martin was angry, but it was the law of the land, so they rode the 90 miles home on their feet. Page 20. North-South Divide. In 1861, after Abraham Lincoln, who campaigned against expanding slavery beyond the states where it already existed, became President of the United States, 11 southern states voted to secede. That meant they separated from the rest of the United States. They then formed their own country, which they called the Confederate States of America. This led to the Civil War, eventually won by the 25 other states known as the Union in 1865. The victory ended slavery in the entire nation, but racism lived on. Chapter 2. School Days. Page 23. With the work ethic he learned from his father, the confidence he gained from his mother, and his own natural intelligence, it's not surprising that Martin was an excellent student. He pushed himself hard, which allowed him to skip 2 grades so that he graduated from Booker T. Washington High School when he was only 15 years old. As a teenager, Martin continued to experience segregation. In the summer after graduation, he got a glimpse of a world without it when he took a job working in tobacco fields in Connecticut. The North was by no means perfect, but it was inspiring for a Southern black boy. There were no broken down water fountains for black people or crumbling schools for black kids, and no sitting in the back of the bus. Coming back to Atlanta after the job ended was hard. On the train home, he sat in any car like any other traveler who had paid his fare. By the time he changed trains in Washington, D.C., however, there were separate cars for black people. In the dining car where he went to eat, he was forced to sit at a rear table with a curtain around him so that no white people could see him. That type of humiliation never kept him from academic success. Following in his father's and grandfather's footsteps, Martin attended Morehouse, a prestigious all-black college in Atlanta. While at college, Martin was already thinking about the next step, a career. He was torn between becoming a professor or a minister. Whatever he did, he knew he wanted to help people. Of course, his grandfather and father were both ministers, but it turned out that one of his favorite professors at college was a minister too. Plus, Martin had proved that he was very good at giving sermons, which is an important part of a pastor's job. Morehouse was founded in 1867 to provide newly freed slaves with an education. The all-male school became the top college for many middle-class African Americans. Former Republican presidential candidate Herman Cain, filmmaker Spike Lee, actor Samuel L. Jackson, and Olympic gold medalist Edwin Moses are some of the school's famous alumni. In 1948, when Martin received his diploma from Morehouse, his dad offered him a position in the family business, Ebenezer Baptist Church. But Martin had other plans. He wanted to keep studying. The following fall, he started school at Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. At the seminary, which is a school where people study religion, there were only 6 black students out of 100. That was a stark contrast from Morehouse's all-black student body. But Martin didn't mind standing out. Martin definitely did stand out at Crozer, but not because of his color. When he graduated in 1951, he was number 1 in his class. He also won a scholarship to get his doctorate at the graduate school of his choice. He chose Boston University School of Theology in Massachusetts, which turned out to be a great decision for more reasons than one. Page 28. Peaceful Influence. While at Crozer, Martin learned of Mahatma Gandhi, a thinker who would greatly influence the rest of his life. Born in 1869 in India, Gandhi studied to become a lawyer in London, and then worked in South Africa, where blacks, and pretty much anyone of color, including Indians like himself, were treated as inferior. He believed the best way to fight racism and discrimination of any kind was to protest peacefully through marches, fasts, and strikes. He called his nonviolent resistance method of making social change soul force. His kind of resistance was not about being passive, but finding strength in practicing nonviolent methods. When he returned to India, he brought this theory of nonviolence with him and earned the title Mahatma, or Great Soul. He used the same methods to help his country gain its independence from England in 1947. Chapter 3. Martin Falls in Love. Page 31. It didn't take long for Martin to make new friends in Boston. And the most important one he made was Coretta Scott. Originally from Alabama, where her father was a farmer, the pretty young woman was musical and smart. She graduated from college with a degree in music and elementary education. Like Martin, she had won a grant to continue her studies, which she was doing at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston. The pair went on a date in their new city, and they talked about everything that was important to them: family, racism, peace. Coretta was beautiful, intelligent, and clearly a good person. That was enough for Martin. After 1 hour in Coretta's presence, he knew she was the one for him. There was only one issue that needed to be resolved. Coretta dreamed about becoming a concert singer, but Martin wanted a wife who would stay home and raise a family while he went out and shook up the world. In the end, Martin won. He was a very persuasive man, and the two were married on June 18th, 1953. The ceremony, officiated by Martin's father, was held on the lawn of Coretta's family home in Marion, Alabama. If Coretta was going to be a homemaker, that meant Martin had to find a job. In 1954, Martin traveled to the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, to be a guest preacher. During the 4-hour drive to Montgomery, he was filled with mixed emotions. He knew that the church would offer him the position of pastor if he didn't blow the speech. Martin liked it that it was a prestigious congregation filled with educated members, including doctors, lawyers, and professors. Still, he was uneasy about starting a life with his new wife in the South. If they remained in the North, they would live in a world where blacks were treated more fairly. During his lifetime, Martin became famous for his amazing sermons. His ability to communicate through the spoken word wasn't just a gift from God. He worked really hard at it. On average, Martin spent 15 hours writing each sermon and learning it by heart. Sure enough, Martin awed the congregants with his ability to talk with passion and intelligence. He would regularly speak without using any notes. The job was his if he wanted it. He and Coretta debated the pros and the cons, and in the end, he started the job on September 1st, 1954, at the age of 25. They might be less comfortable in Montgomery, a city smack dab in the segregated South, but they would have a real opportunity to make a difference. Chapter 4: Sore Feet and High Spirits. Page 37. Martin had been in Montgomery for just over a year when an ordinary lady did something extraordinary. On December 1st, 1955, a seamstress named Rosa Parks, tired of always moving to the back of the bus during the rides she took to and from her job at a local department store, decided she was going to sit up front. The small, 42-year-old seamstress ignored the bus driver's orders to move to the back of the bus and was arrested by the police. Her refusal kicked off the civil rights movement in America. For Martin, his first year in Montgomery had been a busy one. Not only had he and Coretta welcomed their first child, Yolanda Denise, in November, but he was also working hard at his job. As pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, he spent a lot of time trying to convince his congregants to stand up for their rights. He encouraged them to register to vote so they could change racist laws, as well as join the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, known as the NAACP, is the oldest civil rights organization in the United States. When it was started on February 12, 1909, it was mostly made up of white people, although Martin's maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, was one of the founding members. The NAACP fought against Jim Crow laws and lynching, which is a common practice in which a group of people practiced violence against blacks, often by way of hanging. Martin and other local black leaders wanted to support Rosa. It wasn't right for a woman to be thrown in jail for just trying to sit down on the bus. He remembered his own humiliating experience when he had to get up for white people on the bus as a high school student. It was the angriest I have ever been in my life, he said. They decided to protest the poor treatment of Rosa and all blacks by holding a boycott of the city buses. A boycott is a peaceful protest in the tradition of Gandhi, in which a large group of people refuses to buy goods or participate in services until a policy change is made. In this case, the blacks of Montgomery weren't going to ride the buses, and the bus company would lose a lot of money in fares until the rule about moving to the back changed. Boycotts don't work unless nearly everybody participates. So in Montgomery, they printed and handed out thousands of flyers about the bus boycott. And the day before its official start, the leaders preached about it during their Sunday sermons. Still, the next day, Monday, December 5th, no one was sure if it would work. Maybe not enough black people would join the protest for anyone in the bus company to care. That morning, Coretta looked out the window of her home and saw a bus ride by without a single person inside. She called to her husband to come look. He did, and soon he saw the same thing. Over and over, buses kept rolling by, completely empty. The black community had embraced the boycott wholeheartedly. People walked to school, jobs, and anywhere else, going as far as 10 miles by foot. As the boycott wore on, Martin organized a huge carpool so that blacks wouldn't have to spend all their money on taxis or walking for hours. He even raised money to buy a bunch of station wagons for the effort. Even though city leaders worried the bus company was going bankrupt, they refused to back down. As the main leader behind the protest, Martin received threatening phone calls to his house and was jailed for driving 30 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone. The most vicious attack, however, came in the form of a firebomb that hit the porch of his house. It destroyed the porch and the front windows, but luckily didn't harm Coretta or Yolanda. The black community was understandably enraged. They wanted to get revenge. But Martin, who should have been the angriest, told them not to resort to violence. We must meet hate with love, he said. The best thing they could do was not give up, he argued. And the black people of Montgomery did just that for 381 days. The boycott ended over a year later, on December 20th, 1956, when the Supreme Court ruled that black people could sit wherever they wanted. The highest court in the land declared segregated buses unconstitutional. Martin celebrated the huge victory for blacks all over the country by taking a bus ride on December 21st and sitting right up front. Chapter 5. A National Pulpit. The new bus laws were a huge step, but they were just the beginning. Martin wanted to take his message of equality to the entire nation. On May 17th, 1957, he and 20,000 other black and white citizens did just that when they gathered at the Lincoln Memorial for the prayer pilgrimage in Washington, D.C. The purpose of the massive event was to demand the passage of a civil rights bill. Martin made a speech that asked President Dwight D. Eisenhower to ensure equal rights under the law, including the right to vote, for all people in the United States. While women and blacks had the right to vote, there were still a lot of obstacles put in their way. In many places in the South, black voters were turned away for all kinds of reasons. They were asked to pay poll taxes or take difficult reading and writing tests. Even though that kind of thing was against the law, it happened all the time. The success of the Montgomery bus boycott had made Martin famous. Reporters and photographers covered him smiling at the front of the bus. The prayer pilgrimage, however, was the first time that many people all over the country had a chance to hear him speak. His rousing, heartfelt words electrified the nation, and in an instant turned him into the country's unofficial head of the black community. After the event in D.C., Vice President Richard Nixon met with Martin. It was the first time anyone in the Eisenhower White House reached out to a black leader. This massive responsibility took a toll on his life as a father and a husband. Because he couldn't be around that much, Coretta was left to manage their family, which continued to grow with the birth of Martin Luther King III on October 23, 1957. Although Coretta had her hands full taking care of two small children, while Martin tried to change the world, she accompanied him on a very special trip to India in 1959. They spent a month making their own pilgrimage to places important to Martin's hero, Gandhi. They went to his birthplace in Porbandar and to the Ahmedabad ashram where Gandhi started his 218-mile walk to a place called Bambi. Starting with 8 people, the Indian leader gradually walked with millions in protest of a tax on salt. Martin returned home inspired to make peaceful protest an instrument of good in his part of the world. I left India more convinced than ever that nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom, he wrote. To reach a much bigger audience than the one he found in front of him on Sundays, he had to leave the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Of course, the congregation was upset. Anyone giving sermons was bound to be a major letdown after Martin. But they also understood. History has thrust upon me a responsibility from which I cannot turn away, he said in his goodbye sermon. The same year of his trip to India, the King family moved to Atlanta so Martin could focus his efforts on civil rights. Not that he gave up being a minister. He made his father's wish become true by becoming co-pastor of his family's Ebenezer Baptist Church. Atlanta might have been his home base, but Martin was now truly a national figure. Because of his high profile, he could mobilize a lot of people. However, it also made him a target for racists, including law officials who wanted to make an example out of him. In addition to marches, those who were part of the civil rights movement participated in sit-ins, in which black and white students would go to whites-only lunch counters in the South and sit, waiting to be served until the police pulled them out. When Martin participated in a sit-in at a department store lunch counter in Atlanta on October 19, 1960, it was almost certain that he'd be arrested. Sure enough, he was taken to the Fulton County Jail, which became filled with 200 students arrested for protesting that day. For simply sitting at a lunch counter, Martin was sentenced to 4 months of hard labor in the state penitentiary. The excuse for such a harsh punishment was that this was his second offense. He had been arrested months earlier for a traffic violation. Coretta, pregnant with their third child, Dexter, who was born the following January, fell down sobbing when she heard the verdict. Despite his fame, stature, and important friends, Martin was stuck in jail. His supporters tried everything to get him out. For help, they approached Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy, both of whom were running for president. And both ignored their pleas, afraid that they'd upset white voters by taking action. Urged by his friends, Senator Kennedy did call Coretta to comfort her. More important, though, his brother Robert called the judge who had sent Martin to jail and freed the civil rights leader. That November, Senator Kennedy broke through his own barrier of prejudice by becoming the first Catholic president, something a lot of people had said would never happen. By all accounts, he would never have won without the help of black voters, who appreciated what his family had done for Martin. Chapter 6. Birmingham. Page 59. The Supreme Court, the highest court in America, had proclaimed segregation illegal. But in everyday life, blacks still didn't have the same rights as whites. Throughout the South, they were barred from restaurants, bathrooms, universities, and lunch counters. President Kennedy sent a civil rights bill to Congress, but was not doing much to get it passed. A federal law was the only way to ensure that African Americans would have their rights enforced no matter where they were in the country. But it seemed like a lot of white people wouldn't change their ways no matter what. Instead of being discouraged by the situation, Martin took it as a challenge to go to the heart of segregation, Birmingham, Alabama, and try to change things there. It might have been against the law in the rest of the country, but in that town, segregation was the law. Eugene Bull Connor, who as the public safety commissioner ran the police force, threatened anyone who tried to bring white and black people together. Martin and other black leaders took the place by storm, peacefully, that is. Project C, page 61. Known as the most segregated city in the country, Birmingham had an active chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacist group whose members are known for wearing white robes and tall white hats that cover their faces, beat up, shot, and lynched black people. Klansmen, as they were called, bombed so many African American homes and institutions in Birmingham that the city got the nickname Bombingham. Maybe that's why Martin and the other black leaders had to give their protests there a code name, Project C. The C stood for confrontation. In the spring of 1963, they gathered members of Birmingham's black community who were very frightened of Bull. In meetings and services, they inspired them through songs and stories to take action. Not surprisingly, the Birmingham establishment did not take kindly to the sit-ins staged at local lunch counters. Within the first 3 days, 35 protesters had been arrested. After a week, 102 were in jail. The leaders of the protest met in Martin's Birmingham motel room on April 12th to figure out what to do next. It was Good Friday, and Martin's dad was there because he wanted Martin to come home to preach Easter Sunday. Some of the other leaders wanted him to stay in Birmingham to personally lead a protest. A third group wanted him to stay off the streets and instead work to get people out of jail. Martin had a decision to make, and it wasn't easy. A lot of people were counting on him to do the right thing. He left the men and went into his bedroom to pray. When he returned, everyone knew his decision without him having to say a word. Normally, Martin wore nice suits, but he was wearing jeans. He only wore those when he was going to jail. He had decided to protest. Martin led 50 people in a march towards City Hall. Everybody was arrested within minutes. Once in jail, Martin was denied all his rights. Sitting in solitary confinement, he wasn't allowed to make even one phone call. He knew Coretta, who had just given birth to their fourth child, Bernice, would be worried sick if she didn't hear from him. Easter Sunday came, and still he wasn't allowed to contact anyone on the outside. His mind was racing with thoughts. Locked up in a dark cell while the world outside was in turmoil, it would have been easy for Martin to doubt himself. But he was a man of unshakable faith in his mission. Even when a group of 8 white ministers published a letter in the Birmingham News stating the protests in Birmingham were wrong because they created more violence, Martin didn't waver. The white pastors admitted there were social injustices, but they believed the problems should be fought in court and not on the street. Martin needed to respond, but how? He didn't have any paper to write a letter. He had faced bigger obstacles before. Over the rest of his 8 days in jail, with only toilet paper and the edges of newspaper available, Martin passionately argued in a letter that would make history, that unjust laws should not be obeyed. Martin spent the week in jail with many of the other black adults in Birmingham. In order to keep the protests going, one of the main organizers came up with the idea of having children march. Martin, worried about the kids' safety, didn't approve. But on May 2nd, over 1,000 children, from 6-year-olds to teenagers, sang during a 4-hour march. Bull Connor didn't care how old they were. He arrested them too. More than 900 kids were crowded into police vans and school buses and carted off to jail. That wasn't even the worst of it. Later that day, Bull ordered the use of fire hoses and police dogs on any kids marching or people watching. The horrifying images of children being slammed against walls by pounding water while dogs attacked were reported and photographed by journalists who brought the story to homes throughout America. People across the country, angry and upset over what they saw, began to support the civil rights movement. At the same time, the white residents of Birmingham were sick of the violence, and the business owners were sick of losing money. They negotiated with the marchers and agreed not only to desegregate the city, but also to create a group made up of black and white people for better race relations. Birmingham proved the power of nonviolent protest, which swept the nation. Black people all over stood up or sat down for their rights. Turn back to page 70. Freedom Riders. On May 4th, 1961, 2 buses filled with students started off from Washington, D.C. to stage peaceful protests throughout the South. But they were cut short in Alabama, where locals shot out the tires of one bus and threw a bomb in the other. The students obviously couldn't go any farther. That was the end of the trip, but not the movement. Soon, more students who became known as Freedom Riders took buses south to protest segregation. When the Freedom Riders and Martin met in Montgomery, Alabama, a crowd outside threw bottles and stones at the First Baptist Church of Atlanta. A brick hit a stained glass window, shattering it and sending glass over some of the people inside. They were scared, but Martin told them, "Fear not, we've come too far to turn back." Chapter 7. The Dream. Page 75. Some people still refuse to accept that the world was changing and that segregation was a thing of the past. Alabama Governor George Wallace was one of those people. He hated integration so much that he broke the law to keep it from happening. On June 11, 1963, he defied a federal court order allowing 2 black students to attend the University of Alabama, which was the last segregated state university in the country. He actually stood in front of the school's administration building to bar the students' entry with his own body. That's how much he didn't want them to come in. President Kennedy ordered the Alabama National Guard to remove the governor and let in the students. There was no doubt about it. Black Americans needed a federal law that would ensure their rights, no matter if they lived in Alabama or Alaska. That night, after the incident with George Wallace, President Kennedy told the country he would send a civil rights bill to Congress that would give all Americans the same access to public places. To support the president in this effort, Martin and other black leaders led a march to Washington, D.C. that was one of the biggest the country had ever seen. On August 28th, Martin was amazed at the sea of people stretched out across the Washington Mall. The turnout for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom exceeded his expectations. He couldn't possibly have imagined that more than 250,000 Americans from all over the country would travel to D.C. that day to show their support for a civil rights bill. No wonder the rally became known as the Great March on Washington. 30 special trains and 20,000 chartered buses were needed to bring the people to D.C. Meanwhile, not all of them arrived by bus or by train. An 82-year-old bicycled all the way from Ohio, while another man biked from South Dakota. One man roller skated from Chicago, which took him 11 days. Faces at the Great March: Sidney Poitier, Charlton Heston, Lena Horne, Sammy Davis Jr., Marlon Brando. Racial unity, however, was still just a dream. On September 15, 1963, less than 3 weeks after the Great March, the Ku Klux Klan set off a bomb in Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church. Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Addie Mae Collins, 4 girls attending Bible class, were killed. None of them was older than 14. Martin, mourning the senseless loss of innocent lives, went straight to the city he had worked so hard to change, to make sure no black people tried to seek vengeance. He wanted to stop those who wanted to hurt black people, but not through violence. We must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, and the philosophy which produced the murderers, he said at the eulogy he delivered for 3 of the 4 girls. Turn back to page 78. I Have a Dream. Out of a number of leaders who addressed the crowd, Martin was the last to speak. It didn't matter that there were 250,000 people waiting and listening. Like always, Martin didn't use notes. His speech, which was only supposed to be 4 minutes, had a very formal tone. But after Mahalia Jackson, a famous singer who was on the podium with him, said, "Tell them about your dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." He began improvising and changing the original speech he planned to give. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, he said. I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. The crowd came alive when Martin talked about his dream of a world where race no longer mattered. They encouraged him to go on, and he did for more than 16 minutes. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, he said. Go back to page 85. The 60s were a challenging time. The civil rights movement was one of only a number of revolutions happening in society. People all over were actively trying to change the world. Sometimes, however, the wrong people took matters into their own hands. The nation was stunned when President Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. Only 5 days later, while Americans were still mourning the loss of a beloved president, Lyndon B. Johnson, who had become president, asked Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill in honor of President Kennedy. No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long, he said. President Johnson's plea worked, and on July 2, 1964, he signed the Civil Rights Act with Martin right by his side. Nobel Peace Prize. In 1964, Martin received one of the world's most prestigious honors, the Nobel Peace Prize, for proving that change can happen without force. He was only 35 years old, making him not only the third black person, but also the youngest person in history to ever receive the prize. The Nobel Peace Prize was created by the Swedish chemist Alfred B. Nobel. Rich from inventing dynamite, he left $9 million after he died in 1896 to be given out annually to people who have done amazing things in the following 5 subjects: peace, literature, physics, chemistry, and physiology or medicine. A 6th subject, economics, became an awards category in 1968. Civil Rights Act of 1964. The federal bill put an end to the Jim Crow laws. Discrimination in any public place, like a park, a community swimming pool, or a library, was officially against the law in all states. Discrimination was also forbidden in places the public visited, like movie theaters, hotels, or restaurants. A new law also went into effect, stating that companies with more than 15 employees could no longer discriminate among their workers. Although it followed the death of a great leader, the passage of the Civil Rights Act was a cause for celebration. That had been one of the civil rights movement's major goals. President Johnson signed 72 copies of the Civil Rights Act to give as souvenirs to the people attending the historic moment. Chapter 8. The Right to Vote. Page 91. The one important area the Civil Rights Act did not protect was voting rights. Nowhere was the right of black people to vote more trampled on than in Selma, Alabama. Although half the residents in the county were black, only 1% of the voting age black community was registered to vote. That's because there were a number of stumbling blocks in the way of getting people signed up. The literacy test to qualify to vote was as hard as a college exam, and the office to register was only open a few days each month during a time when most people were at work. This was no accident, but a direct effort to keep black people out of the polls. Setting his sights on righting this wrong, Martin organized marches to Selma's courthouse to vote, but it was illegal to march in the city, so thousands of black people, including Martin, went to jail. Those who opposed civil rights were prepared for a fight using every weapon they had. During a voter registration drive, a 26-year-old protester named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot and killed by a state trooper. In the face of the violence Alabama's law enforcement was willing to use, Martin planned a 54-mile march from Selma to Montgomery, which Governor George Wallace immediately banned. Despite the ban, over 600 marchers started walking on Sunday, March 7, 1965, until they came upon a wall of state troopers who attacked them. 70 people were hurt in the assault that included clubs, tear gas, and horses. The images of attacks on innocent people that day, which became known as Bloody Sunday, shocked and angered the nation, including Martin, who hadn't been with the protesters because he'd been in Atlanta preaching. Upset that he hadn't been by the side of the protesters, he organized another march for March 9th. When he left on that march with 1,500 people, the same thing happened. They faced fierce state troopers ready to beat them down. Martin put a stop to the march. He wanted to help blacks, not kill them. After hearing what happened, President Johnson assured Martin that the next time they tried to do their 54-mile march, he would send troops to protect them. What followed was like a dream come true to Martin. On March 21st, 4,000 people from all races and religions, regions of the country, professions, and ages came together to protest in peace. 4 days later, during the final 6 miles to Montgomery, 25,000 people marched together to hand a petition demanding voting rights for black people to Governor Wallace in Montgomery's Capitol building. The law was now fully on the side of all people, black, white, or any color. But just because black people now had the right to vote or to eat in any restaurant they wanted, didn't change the fact that they had suffered hundreds of years under racism. Without the same access to education and jobs, they didn't have an equal shot at living a good life. Some black people started to question what the civil rights movement had really given them. The laws might have changed, but so many opportunities were still closed to them. Many poor blacks were fed up, and Martin started to lose some of his followers to frustration. This anger came to a violent boil in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts during the hot summer month of August 1965. It started when a black man named Marquette Fry was pulled over by the cops for driving dangerously. A group gathered around the police as they arrested Marquette and his brother Ronald. They shouted at the officers, accusing them of being racists and saying that the only violation the men had committed was to have the wrong skin color. The crowd grew bigger and angrier until they started attacking the police. The police sent at least 20 cars to block off the neighborhood of Watts so that no one could get in or out. When news of the blockade spread through the area, police were angry about being caged in by the police like animals. They joined the crowd until the situation turned into a full-blown riot. People took out all their rage on the place they lived, breaking windows, setting fires, looting merchandise from inside stores, and totaling cars. The riot didn't end until 6 days later when the U.S. Army stormed the neighborhood and put a stop to it. Watts riot by the numbers. 6 days of rioting, 34 people killed, 1,000 injured, 600 buildings looted, $50 to $100 million estimated in total damage. Chapter 9. Civil Rights Struggle Marches On. In 1966, the Kings moved to Chicago, which was known as the Birmingham of the North. White people in the city wouldn't allow blacks to hold good jobs or let them rent decent homes. Even worse, black people often were charged more for places to live. A perfect example was the King's family apartment, which was run down and cost $90 a month. That might not sound like a lot today, but if they had been white, they could have rented a bigger and better apartment in the white neighborhood for $10 less a month. Martin was a world leader and could have lived in a nicer place, but he wanted his kids to understand how most black people lived. It turned out they weren't the only ones who got a lesson on what it meant to be poor. Not long after the move, the King kids started acting out, which was unusual for them. Martin realized it was because they had nowhere to play. Poor neighborhoods lacked the playgrounds, lawns, and parks of richer ones. Never had he been more convinced of the need to protest on behalf of economic fairness. In late 1967, Martin announced the next evolution of the civil rights struggle. Called the Poor People's Campaign, it used the same nonviolent action to put an end to poverty, not only for blacks, but also for Latinos, whites, and anyone else struggling economically. Martin had big plans for the campaign. Instead of a one-day march, people would camp out on the mall in Washington, D.C., starting in April 1968, and stay until the government agreed to the demand for a $30 billion anti-poverty program. It was a bold plan, but if anyone could pull it off, it was Martin. On April 4th, 1968, Martin was in Memphis, Tennessee, helping striking garbage workers, who were mainly black, get a raise. He had a lot of work to do to make the campout on the mall happen, but the sanitation strike was a perfect example of how race and economics went hand in hand, so he wanted to be there. Unfortunately, Martin never got a chance to see his Poor People's Campaign through. That night, while he stood on the balcony of his room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis before leaving for dinner, a gunshot rang out. A bullet came out of nowhere and hit him in the neck. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed at the age of 39. "I may not get there with you," Martin had said in a sermon the night before he was murdered. Page 106. "But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." The day after Martin's death said a lot about the life he led. A few days after he was killed, President Johnson signed a bill known as the Fair Housing Act, which made any kind of discrimination when it comes to housing illegal. Also, in the days after his funeral, Coretta, despite her grief, held a march for the Memphis sanitation workers, who eventually got the pay increase they were looking for. Coretta never stopped working to carry out her husband's legacy. She fought to improve civil rights until her death in 2006. Someone had cut her husband's life short, but nobody could stop his dream. Happily, Coretta lived to see a federal holiday instituted in honor of her husband in 1986. Martin Luther King Jr. altered the destiny not only of a race, but also of an entire country. He made America and the world a better place to live. He won awards and international fame for his commitment to his ideals of the equality of all humans and of nonviolence as the only valid method for change. He could mobilize thousands to protest, and he commanded the attention of presidents. He was also a moving preacher, husband, and father. All of these elements are part of his legacy. But how did Martin want to be remembered? What was important to him? In a sermon he delivered 2 months before his death, he talked about what he wanted mourners to think about at his funeral. He didn't want people to go on about his awards or how great he was at giving speeches. Instead, he said, "I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others." Famous quotes. Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth will pause to say, "Here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well." Let no man pull you low enough to hate him. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. I submit to you that if a man hasn't discovered something he will die for, he isn't fit to live. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. The end.